Welcome to Nazir Fears, where your darkest nightmares come to life. This Halloween, get ready for 3 bone-chilling true stories that will leave you questioning what's real and what's just a horrifying whisper in the dark. From poisoned candy and haunted houses to a disappearance that defies all logic, these are the stories you won't forget. If you dare to face the terror, hit that like button, subscribe, share, and make sure you click the bell, because what happens next might just haunt you. The disappearance of the Halloween party guests, 1957. Introduction. Halloween in 1957 was just another excuse for a college party, or so the group of students thought. It was a time for costumes, carefree fun, and the thrill of a mysterious night where things that go bump in the night feel somehow less scary and more thrilling. A small group of friends from a New York college decided to spend this particular Halloween at an isolated cabin they had rented for the weekend, just a few miles outside of the city. What they didn't realize, however, was that they weren't going to a cabin in the woods. They were walking straight into a mystery that would haunt them forever. The party was supposed to be simple: costumes, food, music, and a night full of stories and laughter. But as the night grew darker, something strange began to happen. One of the guests, Carla, a vibrant and adventurous young woman, went missing after a heated argument with her boyfriend. And when the rest of the group searched for her, they found themselves trapped in a series of unexplainable events that would never allow them to return to normal life. The cabin in the woods. The cabin was a beautiful old building, secluded and surrounded by dense trees. The group of students, mostly in their early 20s, were eager to get out of the city for a weekend away. They were looking forward to spending the night away from their usual lives, enjoying the peace and quiet of the woods. They arrived in the early evening, just as the sun was setting, casting a haunting glow across the landscape. Carla, the most outgoing and daring member of the group, was especially excited. She'd grown up in the city, and the idea of being surrounded by nature, away from the hustle and bustle, was thrilling. As the others settled into the cabin, Carla seemed a little too eager to explore the surrounding woods, but they shrugged it off, thinking it was just part of her adventurous spirit. The night went on with the usual fun: music, drinking, and laughing. The group donned costumes, carved pumpkins, and told ghost stories. But as the evening wore on, things started to feel a little off. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees outside creak like old bones. Carla and her boyfriend Tim had started arguing. The argument was over something trivial at first, something about how much time they were spending with their friends versus alone. But it escalated quickly. Carla stormed out of the cabin in frustration, heading toward the woods, her heels clicking sharply on the ground. The others tried to convince Tim to go after her, but he refused. He was angry, and the last thing he wanted was to chase after her in the dark. That was the last time anyone saw Carla that night. The search for Carla. After an hour had passed, the group began to worry. It wasn't like Carla to just disappear like that, especially on Halloween. They started calling her name, walking around the property and peering into the dark woods that seemed to swallow all light. The trees swayed and groaned as if something was moving through them, but no one could see anything. It was as though the night itself had a strange, oppressive weight to it. The group split up, each taking different parts of the property to search. One of them, Roger, the most logical of the group, headed toward the back of the cabin, where a small trail led into a dense thicket of trees. He called out for Carla, his voice barely audible over the howling wind, but there was no response. Then something happened that chilled him to the bone. As Roger stood still, trying to listen for any sign of Carla, he thought he heard something. A faint whisper, almost too soft to make out. At first he thought it was the wind, but then it became clearer. His name. The whisper was calling him. He turned quickly, but there was no one behind him. His heart started to race. The others were nowhere in sight, and the woods seemed to close in around him. He called out, but his voice sounded muffled, as if the forest itself was swallowing his words. Suddenly he felt a sharp chill pass over him, and he turned to see a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the trees. The figure appeared to be a man, though he couldn't make out any details. As Roger stepped forward, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the sound of rustling leaves. The unseen horror. At this point, fear began to take hold of the entire group. They had no choice but to continue searching, even as they began to feel a sense of dread creeping into their bones. The woods around the cabin were deep and unnervingly quiet. The full moon illuminated the trees in stark relief, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. After hours of searching with no sign of Carla, the group decided to return to the cabin and regroup. The air was thick with unease, and their thoughts were filled with nothing but dread. Something about the night felt wrong. They gathered back in the cabin, only to realize something horrifying. Carla's belongings, including her purse and shoes, were gone. She hadn't taken them with her when she left. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air, leaving no trace of where she had gone. The group was terrified. Carla had not just left the cabin on her own. Whatever had happened, it was something far more sinister. The vanishing. Over the next few days, the police launched a full investigation into Carla's disappearance. They combed through the area around the cabin, questioning each of the students. But no one could explain where Carla had gone or why. The only clue they found was the eerie feeling that hung in the air, a sense that something or someone was watching them. But there were no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate what had happened. As time went on, the mystery of Carla's disappearance began to haunt everyone involved. But it wasn't just her absence that left them unsettled. They all began to experience strange occurrences. Some claimed to hear footsteps behind them when no one was there, while others swore they saw fleeting shadows moving in the corners of their vision. And then there were the whispers. They started with the group, but soon escalated into something more. The whispers were not just in the cabin. They were everywhere, surrounding them at all hours of the day and night. Months later, when the case had grown cold, one of the students returned to the cabin, hoping to find answers. But what he found was far more terrifying than anyone could have expected. The cabin had been abandoned for years, its walls crumbling and overgrown with ivy. But the inside, he found something horrifying. The room where the group had stayed that Halloween still had signs of their presence. The furniture was overturned, the floor littered with debris, and in the corner of the room, etched into the wall with something sharp and jagged, was a message. "You should have left. We never wanted you here." Aftermath and theories. To this day, the mystery of Carla's disappearance remains unsolved. Some believe she wandered off into the woods, never to be seen again. Others claim she was taken by something supernatural, a force that resides in those woods. There are whispers of strange rituals, long forgotten by time, and of dark forces that have claimed the lives of those who dare enter the woods. The students who were involved in that Halloween party never spoke of what happened that night, and many of them moved far away from New York, unable to shake the terror they experienced. The cabin was eventually torn down, but the legend of Carla's disappearance still haunts the area, a chilling reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets lie just beneath the surface of what we think we know. The Halloween Murder of a Trick-or-Treater, 1982. Introduction. Halloween 1982 was supposed to be a memorable night for the O'Brien family, filled with costumes, candy, and the excitement of trick-or-treating. Ronald O'Brien, a father of two, had always been the one to make holidays special for his children. His son, Timothy, was only 8 years old, and his sister, Elizabeth, was a little older. The O'Brien family had been looking forward to a night of fun, one filled with the usual excitement of dressing up as their favourite characters and filling bags with treats from their neighbours. But behind the innocence of this family outing, a darker, more sinister plan was already in motion. Ronald had been struggling with a severe financial crisis, his debts mounting up with no hope in sight. The allure of an easy way out crept into his mind as the cost of his family's survival grew more desperate. Little did anyone know, on that October night, Ronald would go to extreme lengths to make sure he could get the money he so desperately needed. The night begins. It started out like any other Halloween night. The streets were alive with the laughter of children, the crisp air filled with the smell of autumn leaves, and the soft glow of jack-o'-lanterns lined up on porches. Ronald and his 2 children were out in their neighbourhood, joining other families in the excitement of collecting candy. Timothy wore a simple pirate costume, and Elizabeth was dressed as a princess, both children beaming with joy as they raced from door to door. As they reached one of the last houses on their route, they came across a neighbour's home with the lights off. The door remained shut, giving off an eerie, almost deliberate silence. Ronald, in his usual cheerful manner, suggested they move on to the next house, but the thought of more candy made Timothy beg his father to give it one more try. Ronald thought for a moment before making a decision. He reached into his bag and pulled out some candy from his own stash, pretending it came from the house. After all, he had planned this evening carefully, and Timothy wouldn't suspect a thing. It was the last piece of the puzzle. Just a small dose of poison to ensure everything would go according to plan. The poisoned candy. As Ronald handed out the candy, including a small packet of pixie sticks to Timothy, he smiled at his son. The candy was laced with cyanide, a deadly substance that could kill within hours. Timothy excitedly accepted the treat, not knowing the danger it posed. He ripped open the candy and took a bite, smiling as the sugary contents filled his mouth. The night continued on without incident, and the family eventually returned home. Ronald felt a sense of satisfaction. The plan was unfolding just as he had hoped. But the true horror began as they settled in for the night. Timothy, who had been full of energy moments before, began to complain of stomach pains. At first, Ronald assumed it was just the excitement of the night catching up with him. But as the minutes ticked by, Timothy's condition grew worse. The pain became unbearable, and soon he was vomiting uncontrollably. Timothy's screams echoed through the house as he collapsed to the floor, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Ronald's demeanour shifted. The carefully planned crime was now becoming a nightmare of its own. His son was dying, and he had no way to stop it. He rushed Timothy to the hospital, but it was too late. The poison had done its job. The investigation. The authorities immediately began investigating Timothy's death, but at first they believed it was a tragic accident, perhaps the result of eating too much candy or a random illness. But as the hours passed, the doctors became suspicious. Timothy's rapid decline didn't match typical food poisoning symptoms, and they sent samples of the candy to the lab for testing. When the results came back, they found the horrifying truth: cyanide. It was then that the investigation took a shocking turn. Ronald, who had seemed distraught, was now a person of interest. Suspicion grew when detectives learned that Ronald had recently taken out a life insurance policy on both of his children with a large payout in case of their deaths. The truth comes out. The evidence against Ronald began to pile up. The police discovered that he had purchased the cyanide just days before Halloween. He had been desperate for money, unable to pay off his mounting debts. Ronald had even made plans to kill his daughter, Elizabeth, with a second cyanide-laced pixie sticks, but she had refused to eat the candy, feeling that something was off. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Ronald's motivations were rooted in greed. He had been planning the murder for months, seeing his children's deaths as a way out of his financial troubles. The insurance policies he had taken out on his children were his only hope of paying off his debts. Ronald was arrested, charged with the murder of his son, Timothy. The court proceedings were public, and the story of a father poisoning his child shocked the nation. Ronald's trial was followed by many, and in the end, justice was served. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. The legacy of the crime. Timothy's death marked a chilling chapter in the history of Halloween. The incident left an indelible mark on the holiday, leading to changes in how candy is handled and inspected, especially during the Halloween season. The term Halloween sadist became a dark, pervasive part of the lexicon as parents became more cautious about the candy their children collected. But the true tragedy lies in the loss of innocence. For years, Halloween had been a time for children to dress up and experience the magic of the season. But after Timothy's death, the holiday was forever tainted by the knowledge that some people would stop at nothing to use it for their own evil purposes. The Haunted House That Trapped a Family, 2006 introduction. The Via family had always dreamed of a peaceful life in the suburbs. They were a typical middle-class family. David, the father, was an architect. Emma, the mother, worked as a teacher, and their two children, Anna and Ben, had grown up in a cozy little home with a yard to play in. They'd been looking for a fresh start, and when they found an old Victorian house on the outskirts of Houston, Texas, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The house, with its tall wrought iron gate and large stately windows, was everything they'd ever wanted. It was affordable, spacious, and tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. What could go wrong? But what the Via family didn't know was that the house was hiding a dark secret, one that would slowly consume them, both physically and mentally. Halloween was approaching, and they had no idea that their first Halloween in the house would turn into a nightmare that they would never escape. The first night. It was the first night the family spent in the house. The movers had just left and the boxes were stacked high in every room. The kids had already chosen their rooms, and the air was filled with excitement and anticipation. They decided to celebrate their new home by decorating the house for Halloween. As they went about placing decorations and setting up jack-o'-lanterns, Emma noticed something strange. The house was unnervingly quiet, too quiet. In the old house, there was a distinct feeling in the air, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The old wooden floors creaked in places that didn't make sense, and there were soft, muffled whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Emma brushed it off as the house settling. After all, old houses had their quirks, right? Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Emma and David sat on the couch, sipping wine and talking about their new life. They had both heard the whispers too, low, almost imperceptible voices that carried through the house. Emma thought it was just the wind, but David wasn't so sure. He felt a chill in the air, though the furnace had been running all day. Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. They both froze. It wasn't the kids. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. They exchanged a glance, their faces pale. They had no pets, and the house was supposed to be empty. It was then that Emma felt a sharp coldness sweep over her, and she realized that something in this house was not right. Strange events begin. The next few days were strange, to say the least. At first, it was little things, furniture being moved around when no one was near it, lights flickering at odd hours and items disappearing only to reappear in odd places. The kids, too, had started acting strange. Anna, the youngest, began having vivid nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night, convinced that something was watching her from the closet. Ben, her older brother, claimed he saw figures in the shadows, figures that weren't there when he looked again. He told his parents about seeing a man in the corner of his room, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, watching him with hollow eyes. Emma and David tried to reassure the children that it was just their imagination, but deep down they were beginning to wonder if something more sinister was going on. Halloween night arrived, and the house was filled with anticipation. Emma and David decided to host a small party for their neighbors. The kids were dressed up in their costumes, excited to go trick-or-treating. But there was a strange air in the house as the evening progressed, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everyone's shoulders. Around midnight, when the last of the guests had left, the family gathered in the living room. That's when the real terror began. The haunting intensifies. At first, it was just small things. Emma heard the unmistakable sound of a child crying in the basement. When she investigated, the crying stopped, and the basement was completely empty. David went to check on the kids, and when he opened their bedroom door, he found them huddled together, eyes wide with fear. They claimed that something had been scratching at their windows. The air was thick with dread. Suddenly, the temperature in the house dropped sharply. Emma wrapped herself in a blanket and sat down, trying to calm her shaking hands. She tried to reassure her family, but she could barely hold herself together. Then, the whispers returned, louder now, and they were coming from every corner of the house. The walls groaned as if the house itself was alive, and the floorboards trembled beneath their feet. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the family saw the haunting them. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, twisting and contorting into grotesque forms. David's heart raced as he watched in horror, the shadows seeming to reach out for them. The temperature plummeted further, and suddenly, an unseen force slammed the door shut. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. They were no longer whispers. They were voices, demanding something. The house, it seemed, wanted to claim them, uncovering the history. The next day, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She decided to investigate the house's history, hoping to find some answers. She went to the local library, where an old historian shared the dark tale of the property. The house had once belonged to a wealthy family that had disappeared without a trace over 100 years ago. Rumor had it that they had dabbled in dark rituals, trying to summon something from beyond the grave. The house had been abandoned for decades after the family's disappearance, and many believed it was cursed. There were whispers that the spirits of those who had died there were trapped, unable to move on. They were bound to the house, tormenting anyone who dared to live there. The historian spoke of the strange happenings around Halloween, the shadows, the whispers, the spirits that were said to awaken at night. The family's tragic end was never solved, and the house had stood as a silent monument to the terror they had lived through, escape and aftermath. As the days passed, the family became increasingly terrified. The haunting didn't stop. The shadows grew more aggressive, and the whispers turned into screams. Emma and David tried to leave, but it was as if the house wouldn't let them go. Every time they tried to pack their things, something would happen. Furniture would shift, doors would slam shut, and they'd find themselves back in the same spot they started. On Halloween of the following year, Emma and David decided to leave the house once and for all. But as they walked out the front door with their children, they heard something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The sound of a baby crying coming from the attic. No one had been up there since they moved in. They never returned to the house. The Via family fled, leaving everything behind. The house stood empty once again, its windows dark and its door locked. The eerie whispers, the shadows, and the cold chill that had plagued them for so long faded, but the house remained, waiting for the next family to step inside.